glad I'm amongst at least some friends, because there's no way I'm going to live up to that introduction. I'm going to amble through some thoughts about the future of work from a, not surprisingly, largely UK perspective, try to globalize it a bit, and put forward some tentative policy responses. I won't be telling governments what they should do. For those of you watching back in the United Kingdom, I will just merely be making very modest, tentative suggestions as by way of continuing the conversation and continuing the excellent conversation. We just had an excellent conversation. I caught a bit of true practitioners in this area. So now you're going to get the central bank version of it. So let me step back first. I'm going to start with a bit of a historical context, what we're dealing with. We have seen over the course of the last quarter century a series of profound disruptions in the way we work, trade, consume, and live. And all of that has meant huge progress around the world. 1 billion people lifted out of poverty. Almost 4 billion now have access to the sum of human knowledge at the click of a virtual button. Global life expectancy is up by 2 decades. But to many citizens in advanced economies, including this one, certainly in the UK, such measures of aggregate progress bear little relationship to their everyday experience. And rather than a new golden era, this era of globalization and technological change are associated with low wages, insecure employment, and striking inequalities. And from a UK perspective, this is the first decade of lost real incomes, those are 10-year averages of real incomes, since the middle of the 19th century. So you have that, you have the wake of a global financial crisis, or at least a financial crisis in the UK, and in the midst of a technological revolution. So if you substitute platforms for textile mills, machine learning for the steam engine, Twitter for the telegraph, you have exactly the same dynamics as existed 150 years ago, and that's what was happening 150 years ago. Karl Marx was scribbling the Communist Manifesto in the reading room of the British libraries. And certainly, today's some of the fractures today are the product of common drivers. Now, the challenge is that alongside great benefits, any large period of technological change mercilessly destroys jobs and livelihoods, and therefore identities. And that was true from the move from cottage industry and agriculture to manufacturing, from the development of the production line out of the original manufacturing and displacement of manufacturing by the services economy. And the question that I want to address today is whether this is about to happen again, but on a much greater scale and at a faster pace through machine learning and global sourcing. By the way, that is an electron exploding. I learned that about 5 minutes ago, but I thought it looked cool, so we should put it up. And then I thought maybe someone's going to ask, so now you know. You got full disclosure. Okay, so to start to bring this into context, now some economists, and there are certainly more than a few economists in the room, wonder what's all the fuss about. And they correctly point out that there's been little evidence over the long term of technological unemployment, the sort of fear that this new technology will displace and that the employment share will go down. And so the top line there is just the employment share in the UK since the late 1700s. The much more dramatic line is unemployment. But in both cases, we're seeing the employment share in the UK today and the unemployment rate at 4.3%. 4.3%, I'm going to repeat for those of you still watching in the UK, you're welcome, is at historic highs for employment and historic lows for unemployment. The problem is that the transitions, or the challenge is that the transitions from one state to another takes time. And workers generally cannot, because obviously workers can't generally move seamlessly from one type of job into another in which they can be as productive. So the benefits from a worker's perspective of the first industrial revolution, which began in the latter half of the 18th century, were not felt fully in productivity and wages until the second half of the 19th. And if you see on that chart, there's what's known euphemistically as the Engels pause, the other half of Marx and Engels, which is that period where the real wage is flat for an uncomfortably long period after productivity really surges. And we'll come back to that. So what economists euphemistically call frictions can lead to depressed local or national labor markets and sharply increase inequality. Now, I'm going to try to set up a bit of a framework. Those are minions, I think, on the left. I didn't check that beforehand, but that's what it looks like. But a framework to think about how technological change affects the labor market. And in effect, it's the sum of three, I'm simplifying obviously, but three major effects. Destruction, productivity, and creation, that's what I'll call them. And the destruction effect is the focus of most alarmist accounts, which is the replacement of labor by technology, reducing labor demand, reducing wages, and employment. Now, less commonly acknowledged at the same time as there's a destruction effect is there is an impact on aggregate demand, a positive impact from the new technologies. And this is an analog of the classic sort of Say's law, which is supply creates its own demand. Technology makes those in work that can use the technology, and that's not everybody, but those who can, more productive. It boosts their wages, and it certainly also increases the returns to those who own capital, and that greater income, whether by capital or labor, boosts aggregate demand and leans against, doesn't fully counteract, but leans against the destruction effect. It doesn't fully counteract, not least because of job polarization. I'll come back to that. As a consequence, over the medium term, technological change tends to reduce the labor share of income, but historically not permanently. And that's because of the creation effect, which is that eventually there are new tasks for labor using the new technology that are created and other technologies that ultimately counterbalance the displacement effects. Okay, that's all context, the past and conceptual. And the bigger question is, could it be different this time? The first point to make is thus far, I think, as we all know, each of those three previous industrial revolutions increased the relative importance of cognitive tasks relative to non-cognitive ones. In other words, since their inception, machines have substituted for human hands, not their heads, or our heads, and I'll include myself in the human race. Workers have been able to upskill and take up newly created sets of cognitive higher value tasks beyond the cognitive abilities of machines. Of course, the issue is that the rapid improvements in computing power, the increased availability of big data, advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning may mean that the new job creation might, for an uncomfortably long period of time, not increase overall employment. That is, the destruction effect may outweigh the combined effects, impacts rather, of the productivity and creation effects, and particularly if automation substantially shifts the boundary between capital and labor. Now, this dynamic could substantially increase inequality for several reasons. Most fundamentally, the more technology substitutes for labor rather than complements it, the more gains will accrue to capital over labor. And an unequal distribution of capital means that automatically, by construction, this will push up inequality. More subtly, if education is unable to keep up with the pace of changing demand for skills, what the previous panel was just discussing at the end, those who already have the skills themselves, those who have the skills going in, will get an ever higher premium. And job polarization will increase the supply of those competing for lower skilled jobs. People will be overskilled for jobs, but just clear supply demand in the barista category, if you will, keeps that wage down. I hope no one's offended. Well, I guess if you're a barista, you're offended by that, but I'm sorry, I didn't come up with that. That would be my last ad lib of the event. The greater global. Okay, and then the other element, greater global interconnectedness exacerbates these dynamics. And if this world of surplus labor comes to pass, Marx and Engels may again become relevant. So, okay, so I gave some historical context a conceptual framework, talked a bit about the nature of the challenge, and now I want to turn to the evidence. Thus far, empirical work shows that increased automation has been positive for employment in aggregate. So this hasn't come to pass. There have been substantial compositional changes, though, and the implication for wages have been less clear. And if you see, it's a slightly busy chart, but the key thing to take is anything in red are the most recent wage prints relative to unemployment, and if those are students of economics, that is a wage Phillips curve in effect, and they have shifted down. So labor markets are just have not been as tight, or tight labor markets have not had the product of having as big an impact on wages as they had in the past in, for example, the US and the UK. Now, we at the Bank of England think that the softness of wage growth following the financial crisis can be largely explained by the combination of underemployment and weak productivity. But it's also possible that this may reflect the early consequences of the deeper process of technological change with more part-time, flexible work and delayed productivity benefits due to two things. One, not enough people having the requisite skills to take advantage of the productivity or the technologies, or as yet insufficient business process reengineering to realize the full benefits of automation. And the big picture globally is that the labor share is going down quite sharply, and the relative price of capital, the boundary between capital and labor, has also fallen quite significantly. And in fact, the IMF finds that technological progress during the third industrial revolution, in other words, computer age, up until the early start of this century, has been the biggest contributor to this decline, so much bigger than free trade, for example. Another commercial for the UK. One country stands alone. Look at that. Stable, but very high. So high to begin with. So the big increase in inequality in the UK following the Thatcher reforms, and it's been relatively stable at that level. And there's not great explanations for why this effect hasn't come to the same degree. There is but big picture, labor share coming down, and big picture as well, substantial evidence of job polarization. Much more job growth at the lower skill end, and the higher skill end, the middle being hollowed out, and the consequence that the returns to education, the relative returns to education, are quite striking across the board. How big of an effect is this? What's the evidence on scale? Here it gets much more murky. There are a huge range of estimates of the number of jobs with tasks at risk, and that's the key. That everything there is important. So it's not so much full jobs disappearing, but it's jobs that have a significant number of tasks that can be substituted. You see ranges from around 9% to 1 in 2 jobs from a variety of studies. I think our view, this is on the right-hand side, is most recent work out of the OECD, with which we would, for what it's worth, be more sympathetic to and think sort of 10% of jobs in Canada and the UK. Substantial, and I'll show you later that it's potentially larger than what's happened previously. One of the things to recognize about all these estimates, or virtually all these estimates, less so on the right-hand side, is that they've all looked at technological feasibility and not married that with economic feasibility. So the example, a simple example would be it's feasible to have a machine pour your drink in a bar, but it's actually at this stage it's not more economic, and of course you lose the value add of having someone to tell your troubles to while you're there, which is why you go to the bar. At some point that boundary will shift, but it hasn't been taken into account, so it's more speculative, some of those higher estimates. So to summarize thus far, if the fourth industrial revolution is the same as the previous three, eventually it should be labor augmenting, boosting both productivity and wages and creating new jobs in the long run. But in the interim, it looks like, even at those lower end of those range of estimates, that this could be bigger than the previous waves in terms of numbers affected, and certainly much more rapid. This is a crude illustration of that, but this is just technology adoption, time on the x-axis, and the various months to adoption on the y. And you see that you see what you know, which is new technologies are adopted much more rapidly now. Just to map this into, is this time it's faster, how quickly do we lose the heads while gaining the hearts and hands jobs. It is the case as well, I don't have a slide for this, but there is a disconnect, at least in expectations. We have surveys of citizens where over 90% of citizens don't think that their jobs will be affected by automation, whereas almost similar percentages of CEO think that exact opposite in terms of material number of jobs being affected, and that this process is about to accelerate. Okay, policy, since this is the public policy forum. So what has been done, and what has been done in the past to cushion the blow? And in the past, public, private, and third-party institutions have helped shrink the duration, impact, and cost of transition, but it's definitely been a learning process. Enabling institutions, incredibly important, obviously, and just the gradual legging out from primary to secondary to tertiary institutions as you go through universality across those, or virtual universality across those institutions as you go through the various revolutions. In terms of insurance institutions, in the Industrial Revolution, there wasn't a welfare state in the UK. The incentives, incentives were really wholly negative, going to the poorhouse, at least trying to avoid going to the poorhouse. And so benevolence was socialized by individuals with friendly societies and cooperatives to support colleagues who fell on hard times. By the end of the second industrial revolutions, there begins to be some support through minimum wage and greater unionization, and in terms of the insurance institution in the UK, universal health care, unemployment insurance, and pensions all come in the interwar years. And obviously, and labor market institutions, hugely important, trade union in the UK, second, and fading a bit into the third. And then finally, in terms of business or employers, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. There have been certainly a subset of employers who have taken responsibility to help create an environment where employees can thrive, from charitable support, true benevolence in the first industrial revolution in the UK at least, to the Ford era of self-interested paternalism in between, to you could term Googleplex as a self-contained community age of today. But often this has been reactive. Often it's been in reaction to mounting pressure. And one thing that I'm going to suggest is changing, not because of the fourth industrial revolution, but just broader societal norms, is that the concept of social license and increased recognition of purpose-driven businesses have meant that some businesses a bigger proportion of businesses are likely to be more anticipatory about this revolution. I'll try to justify that in a moment. Okay, and this moment is coming because the question is what could be done, not should be done, note, what could be done, what might be done. And I think the first thing is get a grip on the scale of the problem, assess and address the skills gap. And everyone can contribute to this. It goes to granular reviews by firms of the mismatches between their current talent pool and their future needs. Estimates by the creators of these general purpose technologies of the breadth of their potential applications, and reporting and aggregation by public institutions of these trends in the labor market. The skills required in the future, as you might have gathered with my sort of nomenclature of heads, hands, and hearts, may be much broader than STEM, and may involve category shifts to more non-cognitive skills and attributes. Said differently, the net result could be a decline in the demand for heads, cognitive tasks, except at the very highest end, which is applying expertise and managing others, but an increase in demand for hands, think bespoke products and services, experiences, experiences with hearts and leisure. So the higher paying jobs of the future may be better measured by EQ, or the skills related to them measured by EQ rather than IQ, and tasks which create as much social as financial value, drawing on a range of non-cognitive skills. Now, the next aspect, so after assessing the skills gap, looking at what should be done on the policy side, I've put in 3 buckets: reducing frictions to applying the new technologies. They're coming, let's get them applied, and let's look how do we deepen the productivity and creation effects. I'm not going to wade into redistribution or social safety nets for, I hope, obvious reasons, and focus more on the creation side. But I think we do need to think about adapting virtually all aspects of what I'm calling here the market ecosystem. But as you see, I'm just going to go through that taxonomy of business, of enabling institutions, labor market institutions, and then finally finish with finance. So in terms of business, repeating myself slightly, but identifying the skills mismatches and driving and developing an anticipatory talent management strategy, by which I mean figure out what are the skills that you're going to need 5, 10 years out, and kind of report that and be part of the system that supplies it. Obviously, training will be incredibly important. There will be distinctions, if this moves rapidly, between training for retention and training for, return to the workforce. And it's an off-cited example, but it's not a bad one. In fact, it's a good one of what AT&T has been doing, which is assessing their workforce a few years ago and realizing that their assessment is 100,000 of their employees are in jobs that won't exist in the next decade, and investing $1 billion in retraining those workers, a lot of whom are being retrained to return to the workforce, to leave AT&T, but taking a much more comprehensive approach. And I mentioned general purpose technology providers and their responsibility to explore how their products are going to be applied in ways that can maximize job creation or maximize broader social benefits. And I'll use the example in the UK of DeepMind, which is one of the leading artificial intelligence developers who spend a substantial proportion of their research budget on debating their ethical responsibilities and have a social research unit to help them put those ethics into practice and really help society think about anticipating the impact of their innovations. On the labor market side, I better speed up or Ed's not going to be able to ask any questions. So this is really important, but I'm not going to talk about any of it. The key thing, I would point you to the Taylor Review. Some of you will have read it, which looks into the question of a whole new class of workers. Think people who work on platforms in the so-called gig economy. What are their rights? What's the right? How do you integrate them with the social safety net? To what extent is their data portable? Are their reputations portable? Are their benefits portable? And how well can we equalize the incentives between human capital investment and traditional capital investment? On enabling institutions, kind of punchline here is around, so if you just play out the sequence, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary education, institutionalizing mid-career education. So think in your late 30s, early 40s, you will be going back to school. Everyone will be going back to school, and the capacity in order to do that. And clearly this needs to be integrated with the social welfare system because hopefully in your late 30s, mid 40s, you own a property, you have a mortgage, you have a family, you have obligations, and it needs to be integrated in order to do that, but it's likely to be necessary well, it's possible that it will be necessary given the scale of the change. And then there are other examples which we may get to in the discussion around more traditional, well, not traditional, but flow training schemes as opposed to institutional schemes, and I give two examples there. Last word ends with finance. It's pretty important that the next phase of finance is consistent with how the economy is reorganizing. I guess it's obvious, but sometimes things that are obvious don't happen in finance. Think distributed commerce, real-time, person-to-person transactions. This is the way businesses are very likely to reorganize, a large numbers of them. Much more effective platform-based or database finance for small, medium-sized enterprise. And for intangibles. So if you're lending against traffic and information as opposed to cash flow and hard assets, you help with this adjustment. And then the last thing, impact investing around social capital. If social investment's more important, this is something that needs to be scaled. Okay, that's my last slide. I have several things to say in conclusion, but really the only thing I should, given the time, is that this sort of optimistic view. In the end, the employment share should get back to where it was. There will be pressures to push it down, to push down the labor share, to increase inequality. We can learn from the past in order to minimize those and accelerate the adjustment. But the one swath of work which will clearly be created by the future of work is for the members of the Public Policy Forum to debate these issues and expand these ideas. So we're all going to be needed. And with that, thank you very much for having me.